Hello everyone and welcome to Green Magic. This is part 2 of the card draw series. This one is about ETB draw effects, and as you can probably see right now, there is another video that will also touch on that type of drawing, but there is a difference between the two, and an easy way to describe the difference between the two is the recent changes to the rules of Commander to accommodate the new companion mechanic. The rules were changed to say you can't have any card that grabs another card from outside the game. It said wish cards are not allowed, but a companion which grabs itself from outside the game is allowed. So this one will be a creature where it draws when it enters, and the other one will be about things that draw when something else enters. And I went ahead and wanted to include an example just to make that even more clear. You can see Season of Growth on your screen right now. It is a 2-mana enchantment, one of which is green, and it says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, scry 1. The other card is Elvish Visionary, 2 mana, including a single green. It's a 1/1 Elf Shaman. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card. So the first one, basically, that permanent Season of Growth needs to be on the battlefield. Then as other creatures enter the battlefield, you get its effect, which is scry, not card draw, but you get the idea. Elvish Visionary, when it enters, you draw the card from it entering. So Season of Growth is more in line with the card draw effect that we will see later. Elvish Visionary will be appearing on this list in just a little bit. So I would like to start by saying, by themselves, these cards are not something that you should think of as being card draw on their own. You would not want to just include 10 of these, call it your card draw package, and move on. You would want a good number of them, like 20 or 30 of them, to really make up for the fact that they only cantrip one single card if you're going to go that route, and I have, and it's pretty damn strong. And you would probably want them in a commander deck that really cares about enter the battlefield effects. If your commander doesn't care about it, if you just have one or two, they're fine. I mean, if you just need a creature slap, but you would generally be better off using almost anything else than saying, hey, I get to draw one extra card that's fantastic. It's not. By itself, they're not. But in the right deck, and the most obvious one that comes to mind will be Yarok, the Desecrated. This is a very popular one from M20. It's a 5 mana, including black, green, blue, 3/5 elemental horror. He has Death Touch and Lifelink, and whenever a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Maybe the wording is a little bit confusing, but the easiest way is to say it's Panharmonicon on a creature. If an ETB happens, it happens in extra time. The difference, or the added benefit that Yarok has that Panharmonicon doesn't, is this also affects landfall abilities. So if a land enters and a creature has landfall, their landfall ability will trigger an extra time. Or if when the creature enters, he has an ETB effect, that'll trigger a second time. Yarok's been very popular in just under a year, so you've probably seen him. You're probably familiar with how he works. You understand what this entire list is going to be. The next one I think of is Karametric God of Harvest. It's a 5 mana, including a single green and white. It's a 6/7 enchantment creature. It's a god, which means that it is indestructible, and as long as your devotion to green and white is less than 7, it isn't a creature. Now, whenever you cast a creature spell, you may search your library for a forest or plains card and put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. I know some people have built this commander as like an enchantress deck. That's fine, sure, but considering that it wants you to cast creatures, a creature-heavy deck does make a lot of sense. And since every time you cast a creature, you get a free land, well, what if you also drew a free card on top of that? Or what if you threw in other things that also get you lands, like a Wood Elves, or, a Farhaven Elf, or something like that? I do have a deck that's full of ETB effects, and it's mono green. But when I saw Karametra, I was strongly considering making that the commander of the deck, because her ability would just add so much more power to the deck. Honestly, when I looked at Yarok when he first came out, even just adding a few swamps and islands to my deck, Yarok wouldn't really have much more to offer it. But I felt Karametra would. So I do think that if you are going to focus on card draw ETB effects or getting lands out of your lands out of your library onto the battlefield effects, she's going to be the more powerful commander. Next is Tishana, Voice of Thunder, 7 mana, including a green and blue. Double stars for the power toughness. It's a Merfolk Shaman. Tishana, Voice of Thunder's power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in your hand. You have no maximum hand size, and when Tishana enters the battlefield, you draw a card for each creature you control. So this one doesn't necessarily benefit you from the other creatures having entered the battlefield effects, so much as she herself is just a big version of the enter the battlefield card draw effect that you'll be seeing more of in this video. So she's just like one of those very powerful versions of it, and you want to swarm your deck with a lot of creatures. Hey, if a bunch of those creatures also draw cards as they enter, you can generate a lot of card draw value that way. There might be more effective ways, but it's just another route to go, and it could be a lot of fun. And the option's certainly there to make your deck more ETB focused. The next one is Riku of 2 Reflections, 5 mana, including blue, red, and green. He's a 2/2 human wizard, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you may pay blue-red. If you do, copy that spell, and you may choose new targets. And whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay green-blue. If you do, put a token that's a copy of that creature onto the battlefield. Now, I understand that this commander is most likely going to be used as a spell slinger. Blue-red, is it instant sorcery, trickery, extra turns, extra combats, forks, stuff like that. Definitely nothing wrong with that. I think that is the cliche, obvious path that most people would just take this commander in. If you were going to go for the creature route, then I think you would definitely want a lot of big, powerful creatures where, you pay 2 extra mana and you get a second incredibly good creature. That's going to really benefit you. But, if you wanted to make your deck very ETB-centric, including the card draw that will be featured in this video, then you could, for 2 extra mana, you get an extra body and whatever those ETB effects are. And you would still want the big creatures that can, just add the actual power to your deck. Next are actually a couple of less popular ones, although they're all fairly new. Grumgoli the Generous, 3 mana, including red and green. He's a 3/3 Goblin Shaman. And he says, each other non-human creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional 1/1 counter on him. So he's not about card draw like some of the previous ones were. He doesn't care about that. But he does care about creatures entering the battlefield. He does care about you having lots of creatures. So if you were to combine him with, an ETB-centric deck, some of which would have card draw, then that's a good route to go on. If you were to go with a bunch of tokens, just to have a lot of creatures, obviously you would want things that give extra 1/1 counters, doubling seasons, hardened scale, stuff like that. But having things that care about ETB effects, such as Panharmonicon and things like that, would be a good route to go with them too. It's at least an option. Now, significantly less popular is Renata, Call to the Hunt, 4 mana, including double green. Star for power, 3 for toughness. It's an enchantment creature, a demigod. Renata's power is equal to your devotion to green, and each other creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional 1/1 counter on it. So this one you could make fairly Voltron just by having creatures that enter the battlefield. I mean, just by having creatures, enchantments, whatever permanents with a lot of green pips, you can make her very strong. and then, you know, just give her trample or evasion or something, and then swing in for 21 commander. Or you could just swarm the board with anything. She doesn't care about it being non-human, so she has that benefit over Grumgully. She doesn't care if it's tokens or non-tokens, so if you don't want to care about the devotion and you don't want her to be super centric as a attacker, you could, you know, just swarm your board with tokens, and they all have at least 1/1 counters on them. A few different ways to go with her. Then the next deck is the one that I previously mentioned that I have built. I do have it as a deck, Nissa Vastwood Seer. 3 mana, including a single green, 2/2 Elf Scout. When Nissa enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic forest card, reveal it, and put it into your hand. Not on the battlefield, but in your hand. And whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands, exile Nissa, then return her transformed into the Planeswalker. So she's one of those flip Planeswalkers. She does not specifically benefit my ETB deck in the sense that she makes the other creatures ETB stronger. She doesn't benefit when the other creatures enter. She just happens to have the same effect that the other ones do and is legendary. Therefore, I put her in the command zone for that deck. As I looked at Karametra, she would benefit the other creatures entering the battlefield or being cast. So that one kind of made more sense, or really did. And Yarok is the poster child for that effect. But I still remain with Nissa as the commander, partially because she's only 3 mana, which means that I can get her out earlier or more reliably, and because she gets me a land to hand, I can avoid missing that 4th land drop, so she is much safer to prevent mana screw, and that's a huge value, a huge asset to a deck to make sure that you are able to just keep moving forward. So often in games, I'm sure you've been in the position where you have, 3 or 4 mana, and you've got a bunch of like 5 mana stuff or 6 mana stuff, including your commander, and you just can't really get online, and so you're stuck not doing anything impactful. Anything that could guarantee that you're not in that position is a huge bonus, even if it's overall pretty weak on the surface. So at 3 mana, she guarantees you hit your 4th land drop, and if someone happens to kill her, and you get up to 5 mana, you can cast her again if you have no better play, and guarantee that you'll hit your 6th land drop. So, she could be double protection, and that's very valuable, but I just built her a specific way. She's not designed to go in the route that I took it in. The final one, which I'll be a little bit quicker about, is Arcades the Strategist. 4 mana, including a green, white, and blue. He's a 3/5 Elder Dragon with Flying and Vigilance. Whenever a creature with Defender enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. And each creature you control with Defender assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power, and can attack as though it didn't have Defender. A couple things stand out. One, he's the only one mentioned in this video that specifically cares about a tribe, and Wall Tribal is not very well represented. There's only a few cards that will enable them to attack, so he is the guy if you want to do that, and a lot of people obviously do, because he is in far more decks as a commander than in the 99. In the 99, he really doesn't do much, so if you are going to play him ever, it's going to be as the commander of a Wall Tribal deck, and that's all there is to it. So now let's get on to the actual cards that, when they enter the battlefield, they draw you a card. And we're going to start with one that is definitely on the weaker end of the spectrum, Arctic Wolves. 5 mana, including double green. It's a 4/5, and it has cumulative upkeep of 2, and when it enters the battlefield, draw a card. 5 mana to draw a card, and then your following turn, after it's over its summoning sickness, you would have to pay 2 to possibly attack with a 4/5, and then the following turn, 4 mana, then 6 mana, it ends up costing you a lot. So there's no reason to keep it past the first turn, which means that you would basically just pay 5 mana to cycle almost. So definitely bad, unless you have some trickery up your sleeve to make them actually viable. This is not a recommended card. The next one is Armorcraft Judge, 4 mana, including a single green. It's a 3/3 Elf Artificer, and when it enters the battlefield, draw a card for each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it. Now, obviously, this would synergize very well with the cards we were talking about a moment ago, Grumgully and Renata, because they have all of your creatures after they're on the battlefield. All of your creatures from that point forward enter with a 1/1 counter. Anything else you might be doing in a 1/1 counter deck that, you know, just spreads them around and gives them to everybody, this would be great with that. Can end up drawing you a ton of cards. Worst case scenario, it's a 4 mana 3/3. Elf is a relevant creature type. Hopefully you have at least 1 or 2 things with counters on it, but it could end up performing very well for you. Next is Bomat, Bazaar, Barge, 4 mana. It's a 5/5 vehicle, and when it enters the battlefield, draw a card. It also has crew 3. Again, I don't really like vehicles. I don't care for that type. I'm not interested in getting into it. But if you want to make a vehicle deck, or if you just find that mechanic fun, if you have ways where you can abuse it, go for it. Here's just an option, and sure. Next one is Carven Caryatid, 3 mana, including double green, 2/5 spirit. It has Defender, and when it enters the battlefield, draw a card. If you're doing the Wall Tribal deck, the Defender Tribal deck, there's an option, or this is an obvious include for that. If you are looking to maybe play more defensive, it does have a good body to it, but I wouldn't just throw this in randomly into any deck. I have a reason for playing it. I do have it included in that Nissa deck that I mentioned before, because I just want a critical mass of ETB draw effects, but by itself, it's not worth including. The next card's Citanul Woodreaders, 3 mana, including a single green. It's a 1/4 human druid, and it has Kicker, 3 mana, including a green. When it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, draw 2 cards. So you have to pay 6 mana to get the draw 2 effect. It's not worth it. I wouldn't include it in anything, and if you have some way of copying him, then the copy wouldn't have been kicked, so you wouldn't draw cards off of those. So yeah, it's just not worth it. Unless you really care about the tribal type or something, you can do that, but otherwise it's very weak on the power spectrum. Next is Clockwork Servant, a 3 mana 2/3 gnome. It is an artifact creature. It is colorless. It has adamant, so when it enters the battlefield, if at least 3 mana of the same color was spent to cast it, draw a card. So this one, you probably do want to play it in a monocolor deck. Doesn't matter what color, but the more colors that your deck has, the worse that this is going to be. Other than that, there's not a whole lot to say. Yeah, I mean, moving on. Next is Eidolon of Blossoms. This one is a 4 mana, including double green, 2/2. It's an enchantment creature, spirit, and it has Constellation, which means whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So this fits kind of both categories. This actually fits multiple categories of card draw. It draws you a card when it enters. It draws you a card when another permanent enters. It's focused to a specific archetype, in this case, like an enchantment tribal thing. Or you could just play it by itself, I guess, and just draw the 1 card, but you probably want it in a deck that is centered around enchantments and have a critical mass. Very popular card. Definitely good if you use it correctly. The next one is not popular at all. It's Excavating Anurid. It is 5 mana for a 4/4 frog beast. When it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a land if you do draw a card. It has threshold. As long as 7 or more cards are in your graveyard, it gets a 1/1. It gets 1/1 and has vigilance. So it's not a 1/1 counter. So I generally would not want to sacrifice a land just to draw a card. Some of you may feel like you're flooded and you need the extra card draw. I want all my lands. But in something like a Gitrog deck, in a Titania deck, in a Corval deck, this will gain you the extra value. And you're generally okay with sacrificing lands in those decks, especially Gitrog. Considering that this is in so few decks and there are 3 very popular commanders, very highly played commanders that would probably want this card, I definitely think that it's underplayed. But you do want to be in one of those decks or maybe a similar commander. Don't just throw this anywhere. But in the right deck, this should be seeing more play. Next is a card that you already saw. It's Elvish Visionary. 2 mana, one of which is green. It's a 1/1 Elf Shaman. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card. Very popular card. It definitely goes in elf decks, which is why it sees so much play. But if you're just including it in a deck just as a throwaway, there's probably something better that you could include. But, you know, it's not a terrible choice to include it either. Next is Generous Patron. 3 mana, including a green. It's a 1/4 Elf Advisor. When it enters the battlefield, support 2, which means you put a 1/1 counter on up to 2 other target creatures. And whenever you put 1 or more counters on a creature you don't control, draw a card. So what you can do with the support mechanic is put those counters on 2 creatures that your opponents control, draw 2 when it enters, buff up 2 creatures that are weak and you just don't care about, your opponent doesn't care about, they don't matter. If you have some way to consistently put counters on other creatures, like an Ivy Lane Denizen, then you can, every time you put a creature into play, put a counter on an opponent's creature that you don't care about, and draw a card. Or if you are doing anything with -1 counters, or something to that effect, where you're putting those on your opponent's creatures, then she combos well with that. So if you're doing any kind of strategy like that, very valuable. If you're just playing an elf deck, you can either buff up your own creatures and not care about the card draw, or you can put it on your opponents if you really need the extra cards. She has that flexibility. Next is Generous Stray. 3 mana, including a single green. 1/2 cat. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card. If you're doing anything cat tribal, great. If you're doing the critical mass ETB effect deck, then this is a good include. Very cheap, and you know, just it fits. Next is Haru-Onna, 4 mana, including a single green. 2/1 spirit. When it ETBs, draw a card, and then whenever you play a spirit or arcane spell, you may return it to your hand, to its owner's hand. Yeah, the second half of that about the arcane spell or spirit is probably not going to be relevant. You could include her in one of those 2 tribal decks if you're doing stuff from the Kamigawa block. The only arcane spell that I think you're really going to see much of usually is Kadama's Reach. Maybe you have a couple spirits in your deck. I believe Eidolon of Blossoms was a spirit. I've already forgotten. So you could find some synergy there, but otherwise it's just a 4 mana weak creature that when it ETBs, draw a card. So if you're doing a critical mass ETB deck, sure. Otherwise, not overly useful. But it is Rebecca Guay, and if you like the art, that's good enough reason to include it, and I kind of do. Next is Kavu Climber. It is a 5 mana, including double green, 3/3 Kavu. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card. It does not see much play, and I will admit that it did not make the cut in my ETB deck, because at 5 mana it's just a little bit too pricey, and at that point I don't even care about the body. It does have a reasonable body, considering that the decks with ETB draw a card tacked onto them tend to be weak. He's still, 3 power and toughness for 5 mana. He's still, kind of weak, but he at 5 mana is just not generally worth it unless you care about the art, which is kind of neat, or if you're just going YOLO and you want to do something more unique that players haven't seen. Next is Masked Admirers, 4 mana for a 4 mana, including double green, for a 3/2 Elf Shaman. When ATBs draw a card. And then whenever you cast a creature spell, you may pay double green. If you do, return it from your graveyard to your hand. So this one does have an added benefit from after a board wipe or whatever, to where you can recur it and get it back. Paying 2 to return it to your hand and then cast it for another 4 would be somewhat expensive, but if you're running low on cards, you lost all your board, it can be valuable to have that recurring value, but mostly you'd want to include them in an elf deck for the tribal synergies, or just a critical mass ETB deck. Nothing special. Next is Multani's Acolyte. He's 2 mana, both of which are green, 2/1 elf, and he has Echo, which means that the upkeep after he comes into play, you have to pay its casting cost again or sacrifice it. And when ETBs, draw a card. Now this is, because he's only 2 mana, he's pretty valuable in an ETB based deck. Most of the other ones are 3, 4, some of them are 5 mana. So the fact that he's on the absolute cheapest end of the spectrum does make him pretty valuable. Most of the ETB creatures are weak and just, you don't care once they're on the battlefield anyway. So the fact that you would just sacrifice them on the following turn, most likely, probably not relevant. You could keep them if you don't have a play your following turn, and so you're willing to pay the 2 extra mana. The fact that he's only 2 mana, and if you're bouncing him and getting the effect over and over, he's definitely a good choice for that. Next is Nantuko Cultivator, 4 mana, including a single green, 2/2 insect druid. When it enters the battlefield, you may discard any number of land cards, put that many 1/1 counters on it, and draw that many cards. So this one would be included in a tribal deck for insects, maybe druids, but mostly insects. Definitely should go in a Gitrog deck, because you will draw twice as many cards. And I know I saw it, I believe Jumbo Commander included this in his deck tech for the legendary mono green commander, where it flips over. It's the flip one where the other side, where it wants you to have 7 lands in hand, and then it flips over, and then all your lands tap for mana equal to the number of lands you have. So in that deck, you would want just a bunch of lands in your hand, find a way to do that, reveal them, flip the commander, then you would cast this, so that you can then discard those lands, get rid of them, and draw that many cards, and actually get your deck operating at that point. But it would definitely work well with a Gitrog monster, or anything maybe with high graveyard synergy. You can find ways to make them work. It's just not my play style. Then there's Nantuko Shaman, 3 mana, including a single green, 3/2 insect shaman. When it ETBs, if you have no tapped lands, draw a card. And he has to spend 1 for 4 mana, where you would exile it, and then you remove a time counter. It would have 1 time counter on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, you would remove the time counter, then cast it without paying its mana cost. So basically, if you have a mana dork, you can pay 3 at the beginning of your turn, have them come in, draw a card. If you don't, if you're relying on lands for mana, then you would need to pay 4, have them come in the following turn, while all of your lands are untapped, and then you would draw the card. So the fact that there's just that extra hoop to jump through, I don't want to deal with that. But if you're playing insect tribal, then he would go in that deck. And if you just want to do something that people don't generally see very often, if you just want to screw around with the mechanic suspend just for fun, then he's something you could fiddle with. Next is Pygmy Kavu, 4 mana, including a single green. 1/2 Kavu creature. When it comes into play, draw a card for each black creature your opponents control. So this one has the potential to really perform well. Earlier this year, some of you may have seen on Command Zone, Josh Lee Kwai was advocating, I believe it was Reap, as his favorite card, where you would get cards out of your graveyard equal to the number of black permanents your opponents control, something to that effect. And his argument was you're usually going to have an opponent that's in black, so usually you'll get at least 1, maybe 2, 3, 4, several cards. It's a high value card. The fact that this one is kind of the same way, except it's card draw instead of getting stuff out of your graveyard, does make it likely a lot stronger than you would think. If it just drew you 1 card, it's 4 mana to draw a card, which is on par for a lot of things on this list. But if it draws you 2, you're coming out ahead. If it draws you 5 or 10, it's huge value. It does have a lot of potential upside and a probable upside, so it should see significantly more play. This is one of the few cards that are in this category of card draw that could just go randomly in any deck, and should go in just any deck that's not ETB centric. It's just very, very good on its own. This is a generic powerhouse, and it's not seeing really any play at all, and it's dirt cheap. Next is Pyknite, 3 mana, including a single green. It's a 1/1. It's an oof, so it has been changed to be an oof creature. It says, draw a card at the beginning of the upkeep of the turn after it comes into play. This is the slow card draw from that era. I know Ice Age had a lot of it. I think a couple of the other sets that came out right around that time may have also dipped in the slow card draw effect. This can benefit you if you have like 7 cards in hand and you don't want to discard, so you more safely draw it on the next person's upkeep. If you're doing something where you're like kind of storming off and you need to keep the engine going to win this turn, he's gonna get it to you too late. But generally speaking, the fact that you draw it the following turn, you don't necessarily care. You're not desperate for that extra card. So it has the upside of possibly avoiding discard, as the downside of possibly being too late if you're in that win now, storm off mode. But usually it's just as good as anything else. What you can see right now is that it's only in 8 decks, and I'm one of them. I am 12.5% of the entirety of this card's of its play. So I do think that it's more in line as far as usability to the others. Next is Regal Force. It's 7 mana, including triple green. It's a 5/5 elemental, and when it ETBs, draw a card for each green creature you control. So this one sees a lot of play, and for good reason. It goes in just about any deck. It does not need to be in a ETB-centric deck like a lot of the other cards on this list. You can put it into a deck that just has a good quantity of creatures. It could be a token deck. It could be a lot of, your own small creatures that you're playing. It will usually draw you 3 or 4 cards at the minimum. If you do have, some of your own creature cards, plus you've generated some, creature tokens from one effect or another, it could easily draw you 10 plus cards. It should, on average, I think, draw about 5 to 6 is probably the overall average in Commander. yeah, it's a staple for sure and for good reason. This is probably a card that you've seen a good amount of. Next is Rhox Oracle, 5 mana, including a single green. It's a 4/2 Rhino Monk. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card. This one doesn't see very much play. I know at one point I wanted to include it in my ETB deck, but I think I took it out for just the fact that it's 5 mana. At 5 mana, I would rather have very weak, underpowered creatures that I can cast for 2 or 3 mana rather than have something that's a little bit bigger but still weak. That's 5 mana. So generally should not make the cut, but if you want to include it, you're not too worried about the mana cost, then, you know, it's not a terrible card. Next is Selvala's Enforcer. It's 4 mana, including a single green, for a 2/2 Elf Warrior. It has Parlay, so when it enters the battlefield, each player reveals the top card of his or her library. For each non-land card revealed this way, put a 1/1 counter on it, on Selvala's Enforcer. Then each player draws a card. So this means that everybody draws a card. So that's going to be either something where you're doing group hug trickery, maybe you're just playing super casual, like a very low jank deck, and your fun comes from helping everybody, and you just don't care about winning. Maybe you have a strategic reason for wanting everybody to draw, like a group hug strategy. The main commander card in mono green that I think that he would be good for is Multani. Not the one that most of you are probably thinking of that cares about how many lands you have, but the other one, which says its power and toughness are equal to the number of cards in all players' hands. So this, would add 4 extra power to that commander. If you can find another way to abuse it, then great, but you want to make sure that he's in the right deck. Next is Sage of Ancient Lore. It's a 5 mana, double star for power toughness, human, shaman, werewolf. Sage of Ancient Lore's power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in your hand. When it ETBs, draw a card. And then at the beginning of each upkeep, if no spells were cast last turn, transform it. Then the back half is Werewolf of Ancient Hunger. Star for power toughness. It's a werewolf. It has vigilance and trample. And its power toughness are each equal to the total number of cards in all players' hands. And at the beginning of each upkeep, if a player casts 2 or more spells last turn, transform it. Once again, I just hate cards that transform in this way because you really have to keep an eye on them, and you're almost certain to miss triggers because there are just so many players in Commander. I think it would be so much easier to keep track of in just a 2-player heads-up kind of standard game, but it's more work than it's worth in Commander. I would, just like the previous card, say that he fits very well in that Multani deck, or another one that cares about the number of cards in your hand. The front of this card would care about the commander that cares about how many cards in your hand, which is Mazumaro. The back half cares about the number of cards in everybody's hand, like the Multani. So he would go in those decks. Otherwise, I wouldn't want to deal with him. But he does have some good power to him. Next is Shaman of Spring, a 4 mana, including a single green, 2/2 Elf Shaman. When it ETBs, draw a card. This one does have the Elf Tribal synergy. I would imagine that's where most of its play comes from. It does have some really nice art. Other than that, I don't think there's much to say. Next is Silkweaver Elite, a 3 mana, including a single green, 2/2. This one is an Elf Archer. It has Reach and Revolt. So when it enters the battlefield, if a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn, draw a card. This one does not see very much play, which is really weird to me because it's an elf. It has a decent body, 2/2 for 3 mana. It's not terrible. It has Reach, which is really good and valuable, and you want to probably put a little bit of that into your deck anyway. The card draw is conditional So you would either want to do it in main phase 2, assuming that one of your creatures died in combat, or if you do have, flicker effects, bounce effects, stuff like that, then its condition for revolt is not going to, matter too much to you. So that, getting the card draw is a little bit trickier, but even if you didn't draw any cards at all, the reach could be reason enough to include it. So I'm definitely surprised that this one doesn't see more play in elf decks. Next is Skullmulcher, 5 mana, including a single green, 3/3 elemental. It has Devour 1. So as it comes into play, you may sacrifice any number of creatures. This creature comes into play with that many 1/1 counters on it. And then when Skullmulcher ETBs draw a card for each creature it devoured. So this one does have a condition to it. It does require sacrifice. So it's not just free card draw, but if you're playing like a token deck and you just have all these other things that you don't care about, or even if you are just playing a deck full of ETB effects and you just have, a ton of Elvish Visionaries and the other cards that you've already seen lying on the battlefield that you don't really have much use for because they're not, big or powerful enough to attack, then this is a way to sacrifice them and get even more value out of those cards. Depending on what you're trying to do, if you're trying to do graveyard shenanigans and recurability, if you care about sacrifice, if you're doing anything like that, then you could definitely find a way to use this card's ability effectively. If not, definitely take into consideration how it meshes with the rest of your plans. Next is Skyscanner. It's a 3 mana 1/1. It is an artifact creature Thopter. It has flying, and when it ETBs, draw a card. This one is pretty good in any of the ETB decks because 2 reasons. One, it is colorless, so if one of your opponents happens to have protection, then occasionally having a colorless card is good for blocking something that might have protection. And it has flying, so it can block pretty effectively anything that your opponents might be able to throw at you. And because it's 3 mana, it's right on par with most of the other ETB card draw effects. So this is definitely one that you would want to include in a deck that cares about ETB effects. Next is Striped Bears, 4 mana, including a single green. It's a 2/2, and it is a bear. When it ETBs, draw a card. I imagine most of the play that this card sees is from the Ayula Bear Tribal deck that became very popular last year after Modern Horizons came out and everyone wanted to do Bear Force 1. Otherwise, I don't think that it's probably in many other decks, but like I do include it in my ETB draw deck, and you could too. At 4 mana, it's, still reasonably priced. The tribal type is not relevant unless you are going for Bear Force 1, but good card, or reasonable relative to the others. Next is Voice of Many, 4 mana, including double green, 3/3 Elf Druid. When it ETBs, draw a card for each opponent who controls fewer creatures than you. Now this card, considering how cheap it is, has to be way underplayed. If you're playing a creature-based deck, you're probably going to have more creatures on board than all of your opponents, unless a board wipe just happened. So you will, generally speaking, the deck that this is going to go in, you expect to draw 3 cards. So 4 mana, draw 3 is basically Harmonize, but on top of that you get a 3/3 body for 4 mana, so that's pretty good. And it's an Elf Druid, so it's got great tribal type, great creature type. This one should see a lot of play. It definitely falls into that generically good, could go anywhere, even if you're not building around the ETB effects or capitalizing on that. It's pretty valuable if you're in any deck that has just a good amount of creatures. Next is Wall of Blossoms. It is 1 mana. 2 mana, including a single green. It is a 0/4 plant wall. It has Defender, and when it ETBs, draw a card. This one sees a ton of play, and I imagine it's just because it is 2 mana, draw a card, so it's, you know, a cheap cantrip that doesn't really do much of anything. So I think that it's somewhat overplayed. It would definitely go in the wall tribal deck that we had mentioned earlier in that commander. This would be a great effect in a deck like that. But otherwise, I don't think that it should see much play in generic use. You would want it in an ETB tribal deck. Other than that, don't just throw it in as a random include for a 2 mana cantrip. You could do better with almost any other effect. Do anything else to help your deck actually function better than this. So that pretty much concludes all of the ETB draw effects, and we will be back next time for power draw effects. Thank you.